Welcome to Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape Podcast. Hosted by Dr. Holly Krutka, Executive Director of the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. The show highlights SER's role supporting our mission to promote energy-driven economic development for the state of Wyoming.
The development of oil and natural gas results in large amounts of produced water. In Wyoming, we're working to identify ways to treat, reuse, and benefit from water produced from oil and natural gas development. This episode features Dr. Jonathan Brant. He's a professor of civil and architectural engineering and construction management here at the University of Wyoming. And he's also the director of the Center of Excellence in Produced Water Management at the School of Energy Resources. John, thanks so much for being here. Let's start by having you tell our listeners about your background and how you came to work at the University of Wyoming and the College of Engineering and Physical Sciences.
Well, thank you, Holly. Appreciate being here today with you. So I studied civil engineering at the Virginia Military Institute in Lexington, Virginia. I'm from Virginia originally. At that time, I got into a research project associated with treating textile dye bath wastewater, which really spurred my interest in research. So I moved out to Reno, University of Nevada, Reno, where I got my master's and PhD in civil engineering. And my research there, my doctoral research, focused on membrane processes. So continuing, I had an eye for academia, and so I went on to postdoc. I went to Rice University and Duke University. Felt like I needed I studied material development, basically nanomaterials, which was another important component later on in my work. And then I decided I wanted some quote-unquote real-world experience, so I went into consulting with HDR in Seattle, Washington, which brought me back out west. Worked there for a couple of years, and just by happen chance saw this opportunity at the University of Wyoming, which ironically I had applied to for graduate school. And my wife and I drove through Laramie, and it snowed on us in June. That was our last memory of it. And so this job came up. It was a small town. We were wanting to start a family, loved the university, loved the town. And here I am, and I've been here now for 17 years.
And we're so grateful to have you. So how did you come to be director of the Center of Excellence for Produced Water Management?
So a number of years ago, 7 or 8 years ago, there was the Tier 1 Engineering Initiative, where state funds were being made available for growing these thrust areas. And so it was we put a proposal together with some other faculty members to build this center. And I was kind of the lead on that, and it was from that I became the director, and then ultimately got continued support through the School of Energy Resources.
Great. So let's start with the basics. What is meant by the term produced water?
Technically, the term refers to any water that comes back to the surface during the extraction of oil and natural gas. And so the lion's share of that bucket of water, that proverbial bucket of water, is going to be what's known as formation water. So that's really old water that's been down in the ground very deep for a long time. And I'll come back to why that's important. And so it's a salty water that contains any number of minerals, salts, and metals. Now, what people tend to think about most is fracturing fluids, hydraulic fracturing fluids. And that is used in unconventional wells where they have to open up that pore space a little bit. But in truth, that fracturing fluids really constitutes a very small amount of the overall produced water volume that we get back. When the well starts, it's about 30% maybe by volume, and that really quickly dwindles off over time. So if we look at the lifetime of the well, when we talk about produced water, it's really that formation water, that salty brine that is quite old.
And when you say really, it's been there a really long time, you mean like geological time?
Yes, geologic time.
Okay, like millions?
Millions of years.
Okay, gotcha. So you have a lot of experience, obviously, with produced water. Can you talk about the challenges with treating produced water and how the handling of produced water in the oil and gas industry has changed over the years, and any advancements you see maybe recently or in the future?
Absolutely. So there's a lot of challenges associated with produced water. Not all of them are related to treatment. I would say the first challenge is logistical one. The oil and gas fields are very dispersed, often remote, And each one of those well pads is generating water that then has to either be managed right there on site, which doesn't typically happen, or has to be moved to a gathering station or a central management facility. So here in Wyoming, we rely on trucking water, and water by nature is heavy. In other places, Oklahoma, Texas, it's more of a plumbed system, so they can pipe it from one place to the other. Each of those different options presents a challenge. The other challenge that we tend to think about is treatment. So when we build treatment systems, we often focus on a single type of quality, overall quality. And there's some move, lesser and more in that in terms of more complex, less complex. But produced water by nature, even for a given well, is going to vary over time. And it can vary in short amount of periods on the order of hours. So that can be a challenge for the treatment engineers.
When you say it varies, you mean like what's in it or the volume or both?
Both. The volume, which is slightly easier to handle, but for example, if a problematic is or what's known as scaling elements like magnesium and calcium, which here in Laramie we're very familiar with, if you ever look at your water heater.
Yeah.
And so that big variations in just scaling elements, their concentrations can be really challenging for the treatment system. And organic loads, the residual hydrocarbons, which has been problematic for a number of producers here in Wyoming, those are all challenges that we have to deal with. And so building a flexible dynamic treatment system and deploying it to these remote locations is a big challenge. And that's something that we have made lots of advancements in. So we have logistics, we have treatment, and where those advancements have come in is logistical modeling, delivering our management stations to the best location that reduces travel or movement of the water. So the smart applications there. And then also with advancements in artificial intelligence, machine learning, we can now build treatment systems that can anticipate and learn from and respond to changes in water quality and even water volume much faster than a human operator can. So now we can have decentralized, relatively human-free operated treatment systems. And that's a big advancement. Another big advancement is smart materials. And that's where that nanomaterial experience has come to help me out is those smart materials can be what's known as selective for specific things, recovering specific things without having to go the full Monty in terms of creating fresh water to get valuable things out of it.
And so out of all that, are there specific areas that the Center of Excellence that you lead is focused on?
So we kind of touch on all three of those. My area and a big thrust for the center is technology development, where we're developing those smart materials, those smarter process trains, which is the arrangement of the treatment processes, and new membrane materials or new membrane processes and new ways for us to get out what we want rather than just putting it through a reverse osmosis system. We also have a group that focuses on identifying viable reuse options for the treated produced water. And we have a group that is focused on the brass tacks, the economics. Are people going to be able to make money? Are we going to be able to get something out of these new advanced treatment systems? And so I believe you asked me, like, how has it evolved over time? And way back when, at the turn of the 20th century, back 1910, that kind of range, you had a lot of oil and gas wells in Texas, and you can still see this today where they would simply take the produced water and spread it out over the land. And you can still see how that salinization of the soil prevents anything from growing back. So that's kind of where we started. And then we moved into what still is widely used today, which is evaporation ponds and or just reinjection into a saltwater disposal well, which is a very, very deep well. So we're sending the water back to where it came from. I'd say in the past 15 years, you've seen a real emphasis being placed on trying to do something of value with the water. And that can not only be doing something with the treated water, but it's really a gold mine. If you look at our proverbial bucket, there's a lot of things of value in there that if we can extract, we can start to make it a money-making endeavor with that produced water management. And that's where you see a lot of people putting their emphasis right now.
And we're going to talk a little bit more about your work in that space in a minute. But first, I want to ask a couple questions about this team you've been working with, because you could hear it as you were talking about the focus areas of the center, but you have really done a great job leading this center to work in a multidisciplinary way. And what we mean by that is you're working, I heard you work with economists, I know you work with chemists, obviously your own department. And so you have like this broad spectrum of backgrounds. Can you talk about how that helps you in leading this center, and what are like the benefits of working with a team like that?
Oh, it's incredibly beneficial. Managing produced water, like a lot of the challenges that we as a society face, really requires all of those different talents. No one person can do it all. And if they try, then I think they're really missing out on like some of the finer aspects of the problem and ultimately the solution there. I would say, for example, I work a lot with some very fine people in the chemistry department, Dr. John Hoberg, Dr. Bruce Parkinson, who have a wealth of experience in material development or material synthesis, but also understanding the finer points of chemistry. I only know enough chemistry to get me in trouble. And so I think if you really want to move forward with doing something with produced water or just water in general, we have to look at all of the different aspects, economics being one, environmental implications being another one, the sustainability of what you've proposed. For me as a technologist, I can say, hey, see, it works. But maybe that doesn't really mean anything in the bigger context of stuff because it's going to cost $1 million to treat 1 gallon of water. And it's a bit of an extreme example, but it gets the point across that there's so many different things to consider. There are also so many different, beyond science, the scientific aspects, just different viewpoints on how to tackle a problem. And so I've learned quite a bit, continue to learn quite a bit by working with this diverse group of colleagues across campus. And I should also mention here in the School of Energy Resources, where I've learned an incredible amount of geology from Fred. And so that all kind of, it just completes the picture. And once you have the complete picture, you can develop, in my opinion, a very viable solution.
And so he's referring to Fred McLaughlin, director of the Center for Economic Geology Research, who you can find on an earlier podcast episode. And I think one of the things that I want to pull out from what you just said is you really focus on developing solutions. And in particular, you do a lot of work around the state, and you get out in the state, you do actual projects that are in the field, and you're looking at how these could actually have real impact. So thank you so much for doing that. And you didn't quite mention that, and it doesn't fit in like a technology bucket or a focus area for the center, but it's worth highlighting that you really are focused on not just innovation, but like getting it out there, pushing toward deployment. So
absolutely. I think like you and other engineers, I became an engineer because I wanted to make an impact far beyond the walls of academia and see real solutions come to play. And so I think we've been really aggressive as a center in those outreach efforts, and we've had lots of good contacts with industry and other stakeholders here across the state and elsewhere. And that just really keeps me interested in learning new things, to know that it's actually going to be used for something.
Well, and thank you for calling me an engineer. I used to be, at least. I still understand a few things, but don't get to use it very often. But love conversations like these where I can meet people really doing the work. Okay, so for the person not super familiar with produced water and the treatment of produced water, before we go any deeper into the things that you and the center are working on, talk about like different buckets of treatment technologies.
So I'll kind of reintroduce produced water too. So if we look at our bucket of water, I have 3 general classes of problematic materials. Problematic meaning those are the things that I want to target to try and get out so we can do something with the water. The first bucket is going to be the residual hydrocarbons, the oils and greases that aren't necessarily, we can only get so much out of it as we're during those first few separation steps when we're getting the oil and gas out. So there's still some of that left in there. That has posed a significant problem for a lot of treatment systems across the country and here in Wyoming. The second bucket is going to be any organic solvents, other organic materials that have either been added or somehow got into the water along its process train. The third bucket, which you'll see a lot of technology focus on, are the salts and the minerals and the metals. And that's what makes it a salt water. If you've ever accidentally taken a gulp of seawater, you know exactly what we're dealing with there. So the first bucket of processes will target those hydrocarbons and the organics. So our first two buckets there. Those technologies primarily rely on filtration, and that can be a media filter, so like a sand filter. It can be a membrane filter, microfiltration or ultrafiltration, or it can be a vortex separator, a hydrocyclone, something to that effect. And that does a good job of getting most of that other stuff out of there. Just give it that caveat. The third bucket of treatment systems that we see a lot of focus on, and this is where I've spent the better part of my career, are desalination systems. So when we talk about desalination, this is going to be the most energy intensive part of the treatment system. And when we talk about energy, we're talking about dollars. And this is what makes a lot of treatment systems not economically viable for produced water treatment. And so those can be things like nanofiltration, reverse osmosis, ion exchange, and the like. And so that's where we have focused a lot of how can we reduce that energy footprint for the desalination. And so to give you an example, for Wyoming, most of our produced waters are actually rather not salty. So it can be from 10,000 to maybe 40,000 milligrams per liter of total salts. So within those salts, not all are the same. We're all familiar with table salt or sodium chloride. The more challenging ones are the things like the calciums and irons and magnesiums, because the chemistry is so complex. Those materials can often be present beyond their saturation level, which again leads to that scaling, which if you've had to clean your coffee pot after some time, you know can be really challenging to get rid of, particularly at an industrial scale. And so we need to get those salts out if we're to do anything with the water, because we can't put it into a freshwater stream. Livestock can only tolerate so much salts, and we certainly can't put it on the ground like our friends in Texas did all those years ago, where we'll have some bad things happen.
So let's focus now on the solutions being developed by the center. So in 2019, you received $1 million grant from the Department of Energy, and that was to lead research into improving oil and gas wastewater discharge in Wyoming's Green River Basin. So can you tell us about that project and any findings you have from that research?
Absolutely. So in the greater Green River Basin, which is in western Wyoming, a lot of the current management practices for produced water relies on surface impoundments or evaporation ponds. So I had mentioned that you have these residual hydrocarbons, oils and other products of the oils, the benzenes, toluenes, etc., xylenes, that accumulate in that evaporation pond. So if you've ever been to a gas station and you kind of get that whiff of the residual gas, that's pretty much what those evaporation ponds are going to smell like. And that can be problematic because as those compounds evaporate into the air, it's an air pollutant, but it also can result in the formation of ground level ozone. And you'll see if you follow the EPA's air pollution map, sometimes we're in non-attainment in western Wyoming. So that was the problem we focused in on. How can we get that last fraction or those last fractions of emulsified BTEX compounds out of the water so that we can reduce the environmental implications associated with the surface impoundment, but we can also help with the bottom line for our industry friends by getting greater fractions of those oils and BTEX out. So again, working with materials and membranes, we aim to develop a smart, better designed membrane that instead of pushing the water through the membrane, instead we selectively push those BTEX compounds. So those BTEX compounds are largely, oil and water don't mix, so they're hydrophobic. That means they don't like water. So we engineered some new membranes based on chemistry, but also surface morphology or the roughness of the membrane based on our findings or others' findings with the lotus leaf, self-cleaning leaf. And what we found is that we could achieve very high fluxes for the hydrocarbons using actual produced water from our partners, industrial partners in the Greater Green River Basin. We can not only get a high amount of flux for the BTEX compounds, but we get a high selectivity north of 90%.
So flux in this case.
Flux is the volume of a liquid that passes through a certain area of membrane. So the higher the flux, the less membrane you need, and then the less energy ultimately you need for that separation. So it's a win-win. So in testing both our lab waters, but also the field collected water, we saw that it is viable. And using a process of electrospinning, we could produce these membranes at pre-commercial scale. And so it works, but it also can work outside the lab, which is, plays to our, hey, we want to move beyond just coupon testing or small types of tests. That was a big finding, that it can actually work on real produced water, not just lab water. That's where we differentiated ourselves from others in this field. And then we also made another type of membrane, which is a superhydrophilic membrane, which means it doesn't foul as much. So membrane fouling is where when you treat water, the performance declines over time. It takes more energy, again, more money. And so this superhydrophilic membrane performed much better than its commercial counterparts. So I would say that the project was a success.
Yeah, great project, great outcomes. So the whole reason we're talking about produced water, why this is a center of excellence, why it's so important to look at, is the impact in our case to Wyoming. Of course, that's a much broader issue than just Wyoming. And it's really costly. It limits our ability to do oil and gas production, and it's really looked at as a challenge. But some of your work has really been focused on beneficiation, kind of looking at the upside and the positive. So flipping that all upside down and understanding if we can treat produced water sufficiently, that we can get things out of it that have a lot of value, that we can get water that's usable. So can you talk about your efforts around beneficiation and looking at that positive side of produced water?
Absolutely. So if anybody listening or hasn't been to Wyoming, we're about the fifth most arid state in the union. And that varies depending on year, fourth or fifth. And we're also about the fifth largest producer of produced water in the union. Again, that goes up or down from year to year. So we have a lot of this resource that could help us out a lot, not only the industry, but also the greater citizens of Wyoming. And so where we started about a decade ago looking at is, okay, well, how can we just treat that water to create something clean that we can do all these amazing things with? And that we made a lot of advancements there, but it still became quite difficult to compete against reinjection or just a simple evaporation. Now, as that became more and more difficult, there was more pressure on the industry and others to say, hey, you can't just put it down hole, or getting a new surface impoundment. That has its limitations too, because once the impoundment's full, then I can't produce any more oil and gas if I can't dispose of the water. And so with that growing motivation, we're like, okay, take a real hard look. What can we do with the water? We know we're not going to drink it or anything like that, but we can do lots of cool things like land reclamation when we reclaim these these oil and gas sites, because it's difficult. We don't get a lot of rain, so we oftentimes have to go through multiple seeding events. We can do some stream augmentation, and that's a fancy way of saying we can add water to the streams and rivers, which during periods of drought certainly help the downstream entities in the greater Colorado River Basin and others. We can use it for irrigation, growing crops, or in some cases even livestock watering. So take some of those pressures off of the many different communities that make up Wyoming, not only the oil and gas folks. And then some of the lower hanging fruit is we can use it in an industrial application, so reducing the amount of water that the industry has to acquire and pay for. So you hear me mention a lot the bottom line. So how can we improve the bottom line? Well, instead of just looking at one outcome, which is cleaner water, what about if we can start producing materials of value from that wealth of salts and metals and minerals that make up the water? And so just to ring off a few, the lower hanging fruits, soda ash, rock salt, those are the easy ones. And then if they're present, which we have found through a number of studies done through the School of Energy Resources, are things like rare earth elements, everything that makes up all of our electronic devices and we're horribly dependent on foreign entities for. Precious metals, lithium, that make up our computer batteries and phone batteries and all those EVs that are hitting the market. Many, many other different things. And so that's where we started to say, if we can get that stuff out, then we can make producing the clean water work financially. We can come out ahead. And that's really within the past 5 or so years, you've seen a lot of work and a lot of exciting results.
That is exciting. So I'm curious, when you think about technology development, the produced water from any specific site, it can be really different from a different site, and it can even change at that site. But you're developing technologies that I guess you would be able to tailor to different sites. Are they more amenable to certain sites? Like, how do you develop technologies to treat something that's so different from location to location?
That's an excellent question, and that's a very difficult challenge to come over. So I kind of mentioned way back when we were focused, when we do a treatment system, as you no doubt know, you kind of focus in on a very narrow range of qualities. What we aim to do is to build a very modular, plug and play, interchangeable type of system that can work for a wide variance. It can't capture everything, but it can capture a wide variance in qualities. And so what does that mean? So the system is more robust. So on the front end, it seems like, well, that costs more. But which means that we have some systems that will be more stressed for certain waters and some systems that'll be less stressed in those instances. But the cost of that is usually outweighed by the flexibility and ability to respond to many different sites within a single place. So what we might target is not for the whole state of Wyoming, but we just target the Greater Green River Basin, or we target produced waters in the Powder River Basin, which are certainly different at a given well or from site to site, but there is a certain range of qualities and chemistries that we can capture. And so the other thing that we have to think about is we have water coming in, but all of these are separation systems. So we still have a waste or wastes that go out. And so our job is not done till we identify a suitable management strategy for those wastes. For example, if we have waters high in silica and hardness, the calcium and magnesiums, then we know we're going to get this slurry material that we still have to dispose of. And so how can we do that and do it quick enough so that we don't slow down or strand assets out in the field?
Great. So one of the other areas that we haven't talked about yet that the center is working on is hydrogen, and really creating hydrogen from produced water. Can you tell our listeners about that area of research?
Absolutely. So, it's no secret that renewable energy systems in Wyoming are growing and growing. Solar farms and wind farms. Having that green energy available has made producing hydrogen very attractive, which is an energy-intensive process in and amongst itself. The missing component there is water. And so we know we don't have an overabundance of fresh water, or it's all allocated right now, but we do have this abundance of these brines or produced waters. So now, again, everything comes down to the brass tacks. How can we treat that is it viable or feasible to treat that brine or produced water while still coming out ahead energy-wise, or the amount of hydrogen we produce for the overall system? And so our work has focused on the beating heart of the treatment system, with the desalination system. How can we reduce the energy consumption of whatever membrane process that we're utilizing there to get the salts out? And so we have made some advancements with not just the membrane development itself, but also some different magnetic technologies to better condition that water so it doesn't take as many kilowatt hours to push it across the membrane, thereby making treatment a little bit more viable.
Great. So in the world of research, innovation and learning, often even just the work you do every day, it leads to surprises, things you didn't expect to happen when you started a specific research focus. So can you talk about a time that happened for you or your center, and what happened and what was so surprising?
Absolutely. So surprises happen all the time, and that's what makes research fun.
Exactly.
Especially when it works out in your favor.
Yeah.
So we, through another project here at the School of Energy Resources, we're tasked with, if we get this coal char or coal in general, is there something that we can do with it from a treatment perspective? And I was honestly very skeptical that we were going to get anything of value out of this, but hey, it's research, and why not give it a shot? And so we received this coal char, which is coal that's undergone pyrolysis, and by itself it was big and chunky for our purposes, and we were trying to find ways to get it smaller or finer so that we could do something with it, in this case making membranes. We, by chance, found out that we could break that coal char down and get an incredibly conductive carbon material. So for those that are out there, if you've heard of things like graphite is a very exciting two-dimensional, which means it's on a single sheet. It's no thickness, it's flat, which has all kinds of interesting properties. Basically, its ability to conduct electrons. The downside with graphite is it's also very expensive to make. The upside for us is we got a material that's graphitic in nature, very cheap to make, relatively speaking, and boy, does it make a great membrane, electrically conductive membrane. And you may ask yourself, well, who cares? Well, if you've heard of things like fuel cells or membranes that can selectively separate different ions, think about those rare earths or precious metals, the applications are really limitless. And so I was super excited about that, made a highly charged membrane, and then I was even more excited when we saw how it compared against its commercial counterpart, which is Nafion. Nafion is the gold standard right now in fuel cells, and one of the challenges with fuel cells is, boy, they're expensive, and boy, they're expensive because of the Nafion membrane. And so I was floored. I was floored in a happy way that this material that, we just tend to think of heat, energy production, combustion, basically, boy, there's so many different applications for it now. And so really, just keep an open mind, and I think discoveries like that will happen.
Yeah, that's really cool. And how cool would it be if we eventually end up in a place where we're using a char created from Wyoming coal to clean up produced water around the state and beyond?
Absolutely.
And recover some really valuable stuff for all kinds of industries.
And we're also looking at it for gas separation, such as carbon dioxide and hydrogen.
Cool. So based on all this work, years of expertise, you also have a spin-off company. Can you talk about that a little bit, and what's the focus of the company? And start with the name.
Sure. It is the Magnesis Corporation. And the focus of the Magnesis Corporation, which was born out of an earlier spinoff, Wyoming Water Innovations, our focus there is the development of advanced systems for doing a variety of things. One of that focus is water treatment. Another focus is hydrogen production, using a variety of processes combined together to form a system. And so you may wonder, well, why Magnesis? Well, if you remember the Zelda video game, it kind of comes from that video game, but it's our focus on magnetic systems and how magnetic fields can be used to not only improve existing systems like our reverse osmosis system, but it can also be used for transforming or helping the transformation of different feedstocks like carbon dioxide to cool things like methanol and other products. So our vision is thinking beyond what is very conventional, which tends in the water community or process community, we stay with what works. We're really using different energy sources to try and really push the envelope.
Great. So you have obviously a lot of experience, a lot of passion, interest around the area of produced water. What would you say to a student maybe in high school or early in their college career that was interested in pursuing this field?
The first thing I would say is, although a lot of my talk is focused on treatment and technologies, is think back to how diverse this problem is. And so no matter where your interests are, be it biology or microbiology or economics or chemistry, whatever it is, all of those disciplines are desperately needed to really maximize this resource that we've been given, which is produced water. And so I would say do not limit yourself to just thinking you have to be an engineer. Now, beyond that is really, I would also encourage you to look around for the folks here in Wyoming, look around your communities. Just about every community can either use water or is being impacted by produced water or needs to diversify their local economies. And so I think we've touched on each one of those different aspects during this talk. For example, if you're a rancher and you've got, somebody operating wells on your site, how can it be done better to help you as the rancher, kind of to improve your drought proofness, if you will? So again, my first thing is don't get limited. The second thing is dig deep into some of the fundamental things that we talked about and understand not only the implications for society, but really the cool chemistries and this, the cool chemistries, the cool engineering, the cool innovations that can happen to help us all. So,
great.
Yeah.
And is there anywhere you would recommend people look to learn more about this field in general?
I would go to our center page, cepwm.com, but also the Bureau of Reclamation and the Department of Energy both have good repositories on the overall picture of produced water and some of the intricacies associated with each state. Because how we do it is different than how Oklahoma does it, New Mexico does it, and all those good things. And then New Mexico also has a produced water consortium that can also provide a different viewpoint as well.
Great. So our last question, let's let our listeners learn a little bit more about you. So one question we always like to ask is, what is your favorite place to visit in Wyoming?
My favorite place to visit in Wyoming is Seminole State Park, which is about 40 miles north of Sinclair. Now, I probably shouldn't say that because one of the beauties of Seminole State Park is that it's not very crowded. It's empty. But it's a beautiful reservoir. It's great fishing on the Miracle Mile. Take my family camping there all the time. There are beaches. And I swear there's just something magical about those mountains that surround the reservoir. And everybody out there is just truly fantastic. So probably not, you would expect somebody to say Yellowstone or the Tetons, which are ungodly beautiful, and I love those places, but I kind of find myself there at Seminole.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much for all you do for School of Energy Resources, for your department, for the center, for the university, for the state, and your students. Thanks so much for everything you do, and thanks for doing the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much, Holly. It was great being here with you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape, the podcast that highlights the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. You can expect a new episode of Energy Frontier every Wednesday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. See you next time.